Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 18 in our series on the Trivium. That is the first three of the classical liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. We are today thick into our discussion of the logic of arguments. Last time we introduced the categorical syllogism. We talked about the components included in each syllogism, the figure and the mood, different ways to assess a given syllogistic argument. And today we'll be talking about the validity of syllogisms. So when we say validity, I thought this was kind of a fun image. We're not talking about whether the premises are true. We're talking about whether you are following the rules of logic, um, as you would the rules of mathematics, for example, to reach a conclusion that validly follows from the premises. So there are four rules that we'll be discussing in relation to this. The four rules are, okay, right out of the gate. The four rules are, I've got a syllogism, right? And if you don't know what a syllogism is, have a look at the last lecture. There've got to be precisely three terms in the syllogism: a subject term, a predicate term, and a middle term. Also, it's important that those be clear, that they actually be the same terms. If you're using different terms that are kind of ambiguous in their meaning, you might end up with an invalid argument and thus with an untrue conclusion. The second rule concerns the middle term. The middle term has to, quote, securely link, as Hauser puts it, the subject and the predicate, as we saw with the case Socrates is mortal, right? What is the egg in the cake? What is holding together the S and the P? It is the middle term. In order for the syllogism to be valid, the middle term must be universal at least once in the premises in order to, quote, securely link. That's what securely link means. The middle term is universal at least once. Regarding the quantity of the premises in the syllogism, it's important to note that you cannot make a universal conclusion from particular premises. And this, happily, is a pretty clear thing. I can't meet one person from Canada and say, I don't like anyone from Canada, right? I'm drawing a universal conclusion from a particular experience with a single individual. And this, we would say, stands to reason. You can't do that, right? This is one of the most common kind of errors in argumentation. But also, quality has to be considered, and that's our fourth rule. If one of the premises is negative, then the conclusion also has to be negative. So let's take a look at each of these four rules, and then we'll look at some ways that they can go wrong. So the first rule, there must be precisely three terms: S, P, and M. The subject term, the predicate term, and the middle term. And as I said, you got to take care with ambiguity. We'll see this a little later in the fallacy of equivocation. Those terms must have the same meaning. In this case, they do. All animals are living things. All leopards are animals. Therefore, all leopards are living things. I will hazard that both of those premises are true, and the conclusion does in fact validly follow from those two premises. Animals means the same thing in both cases. Leopards and living things also, we have no reason to think that those terms are ambiguous. This satisfies Rule 1. In the case of Rule 2, the middle term needs to securely link S and P, and as we said, that means it needs to be universal at least once. In this case, it is in fact universal precisely once. All animals, middle term, are living things. That is the instance in which the term animals, the middle term, is universal. The second premise, all leopards are animals. In that case, as we saw in an earlier lecture, the predicate there, animals, is actually particular, because you're not talking about all animals in the world. You're talking about only those animals which are leopards. You're talking about a subset of animals taken at large, right? So all leopards are animals. Animals is particular. Therefore, all leopards are living things. The middle term, animals, does in this case securely link the subject and the predicate, leopards and living things, because it appears at least once universally in the argument. That is, in the first premise here, all animals are living things. The middle term is universal, animals. In the case of Rule 3, this regards quantity. You can't make a universal conclusion from particular premises, right? So let's take a look at this. Here we have all animals are living things, all leopards are animals, therefore all leopards are living things. No problem with this here. None of these premises are particular. They're both A propositions. If we want to go back to our letters, this is an A syllogism. And our fourth rule pertains to quality. If one of the premises is negative, the conclusion will also be negative. Well, as we can see in our familiar example by now, none of these premises, neither of these premises are negative, and the conclusion also is not negative, so no problem. About the negative truth value of the premises, it's useful to add one additional slide here. If you have two affirmative premises, as we do in this case, the conclusion will, we can be sure, be affirmative. If you have one affirmative premise and one negative premise, the conclusion will be negative. So this is like multiplying a number by a negative number in mathematics, right? So the conclusion, not the conclusion, the result will be negative if you multiply a number by a negative number. In the case of two negative premises, though, and I guess this is different than mathematics, you can't draw a conclusion from two negative premises. At least one of the premises needs to be affirmative. And if only one of them is affirmative, then the conclusion is negative. So take a look at these rules. I hope I'm stating it clearly enough, but I think it's pretty straightforward. And we are presented again with our four rules. Three terms, securely linked, subject and predicate. Make sure the quantity is right, and make sure the quality is right. In Hauser's work, Logic as a Liberal Art, which is serving as our guide in this series, he provides a longer list of how to assess any given argument, that is, any given categorical syllogism, by finding the terms, as we discussed last time, finding the figure and mood, as we discussed last time, and then applying the four rules in various ways. So I've highlighted on our slide here a kind of basic structure of this list of steps. If you'd like to assess any categorical syllogism, this is the way to do it. So on this table here, we're going to talk about fallacies for a minute, right? There are lots of ways to go wrong and only one way to go right. So on our chart here, on the y-axis, we have fact, and on the x-axis, we have logic. So on the y-axis, a proposition can either be factually correct or factually incorrect. And you have to determine that, as we said, by induction. You have to actually look at the world and figure out what is true. In the case of logic on the x-axis, it can either be logically correct or logically incorrect. And this is what we meant by validity, right? Is the argument following the rules of logic? And a proposition will be true, or an argument, I should say, will be valid and the conclusion true only in the case that the logic is correct and the facts are correct. The premises have to be true, and the steps that you use to join those premises together and to form the conclusion must also be true. So there are four examples that we're just going to touch on briefly of fallacies related to the structure of arguments. Right? So this is ways that syllogisms can go wrong, and we have a few, I think, pretty nice examples here. So equivocation is the word we use to talk about a syllogism or an argument that violates Rule 1. That is, that it does not have an S term, a P term, and an M term that are consistent and exclusive, right? So the argument should only have those terms. In this case, let's take a look at our example. Taxes are a true headache. Painkillers will make a headache go away. Therefore, painkillers will make taxes go away, if only, right? We can see here that the term headache, I am equivocating, we would say, on that term, right? I'm using it in a figurative sense in the major premise, the first one, and I'm using it in a literal sense in the minor premise, the second one. So because I'm using it in a different sense, I get this funny conclusion. And there's something interesting probably here to say about comedy as well, right? But this is funny because it contains equivocation. A second way that a syllogism can go wrong is what's called an undistributed middle term. And this is something that violates Rule 2, as we see in this case. The example is, all dogs are living creatures, all cats are living creatures, therefore all cats are dogs. Okay, so I've got a middle term, it's living creatures. It appears in both premises. The subject term is in the minor premise. The predicate term is in the major premise. All's good, right? But we're looking at an absurd conclusion. All cats are dogs. Well, it's clearly not true. What went wrong? Well, in this case, the middle term never appears universally. So basically, I'm talking about some subset of living creatures that are dogs and another subset of living creatures that are cats. That's very nice. So I can say, okay, you could say both cats and dogs are living creatures, but you can't conclude that all cats are dogs because the middle term never appears universally. The middle term must appear universally at least once in order for an argument to be valid, categorical syllogism to be valid. Two more cases here pertaining to rules 3 and 4. Violations of Rule 3 are what we call overextended terms. And this is when we try to draw a universal conclusion from a particular premise. Right? So this is like, I met one person from Canada, I didn't like him, therefore I don't like anyone from Canada. Right? This is a kind of paradigm case of bad logic. In our example here, all cops are well trained. No firemen are cops. Therefore, no firemen are well trained. In the major premise here, all cops are well trained, or actually, I guess that would be the minor premise. This is not a figure 1 syllogism. In the first premise, let's say, well trained, as indicated here, appears as a particular term, right? So I'm only talking about the subset of well trained people who are cops, right? So therefore, because I'm only dealing with that particular, the middle term is only particular, or the predicate term in this case is only particular, I can't derive a conclusion that refers to well-trained people universally in general, right? I'm not covering enough ground. I'm overextending the term to draw the untrue conclusion, and in this case also invalid conclusion, that no firemen are well-trained. So I can't go from a particular to a universal. Now we have a final example here, a couple examples. Violations of Rule 4. And these are pretty straightforward violations. We don't follow the negative premise. So remember, if you have one premise that is affirmative and one negative, then the conclusion has to be negative. If you have two affirmative premises, the conclusion has to be affirmative. And if you have two negative premises, you can't derive anything from that at all. You can't. It doesn't yield any conclusion. So in this case, we have all crows are birds. Some wolves are not crows. Therefore, some wolves are birds. Well, yeah, that's just kind of a nonsense argument. But what we're looking at is the example of the not, right? Because you have one negative premise here. And that should make the conclusion negative, but the conclusion is not negative. Second example, all triangles are three-angled polygons. All three-angled polygons are three-sided polygons. Therefore, some three-sided polygons are not triangles. Not a well-constructed argument. And the immediate problem, we could find several problems with this argument, is that the conclusion is negative, whereas both of the premises are affirmative. If both premises are affirmative, then the conclusion will also need to be affirmative. Friends, okay, so what we've done is looked at the rules for determining whether a categorical syllogism, that's a deductive argument constructed out of two premises, is valid. So can we know that we are following the rules of logic? Well, the rules of logic, for our purposes in this series, are the four rules identified here. And as with everything in the course, you can find examples of categorical arguments and the deductive arguments made in anything you read anywhere. And you can use these rules of equivocation, overextension of terms, and so forth to identify precisely why an argument is wrong, not just because you feel it's wrong, but because it does, in fact, violate one of these rules of validity. Thank you.